Alright, so a couple of years ago, I reviewed the game No More Heroes due to it being something that I was interested in, as well as the then upcoming release of spin-off Travis Strikes Again, and I found it to be an enjoyably quirky experience. Now here I am only a mere 2 years later, finally talking about the sequel.
No more heroes, it's hero begin to catch on nobody but yourselves, nothing less to do. No more heroes, no time to stand still if you're gonna be number one.
It's been so long since I talked about the first game that not only did Travis Strikes Again release, but a third main entry in the series was announced and very recently delayed. I'll confess that I wanted to knock out a short game to review before the release of the Mario 3D All-Stars Collection, one of those games I'll also be reviewing, and this fit that bill. And it was also good to finally knock this one off my gaming backlog. So after the postponement of that third game, let's fill in that time and go over what I made of this sequel. Travis is back after becoming the #1 assassin in Santa Destroy. But in the game's opening, which sees him take down the 51st ranked assassin, he's sent right back down to that position, and is instructed by Sylvia to work his way back up to the top again. But this time, it's personal, as that first boss was looking to avenge his brother who Travis killed in the first game's opening cutscene, leading to the murder of the comic book shop owner who was also Travis's best friend. The people who killed him were hired by the #1 ranked assassin, so Travis goes on yet another killing spree to inflict revenge. He also gradually begins to question whether the cold blood that has been shed in the pursuit of vengeance will be worth it.
Assassins aren't tools. As fucked up as we might be, we're humans too.
Okay, I'm not going to overlook the fact that this game might have single-handedly inspired The Last of Us Part 2. Right down to the person the initial Avenger was avenging is someone most players don't even take note of in the first game. The similarities are pretty funny to me. But No More Heroes doesn't take this premise quite as seriously as Naughty Dog's game, as this story gets even more self-aware and straight up bonkers compared to the original. I'll admit that the assassins themselves didn't feel as distinctive and memorable as they did in the first game, but Travis remains a really likable, douchey character, and the humour also continues to appeal. It's basically the same plot as the first game with a couple of brief moments that slightly differentiate the two, but it doubles down on the perverted, wacky and smug nature of its predecessor without giving a single crap, and I enjoyed it for that. This is pretty much a textbook video game sequel in that it's just more of the same. However, there is a pretty big omission made here, and that's the lack of the overworld. Instead of travelling around on your bike doing jobs, you now just select a location and boom, you're there. I did find this jarring at first, even though Santa Destroy wasn't that interesting a place in the original, although I did like riding the bike, but I soon found myself okay with this change. And the bike does make a couple of small appearances in one of the side jobs, a random bit as build up to a boss fight as well as in a boss fight at the start, although that bit sucks. It's so awkward to control, even your enemy doesn't want to be there. You might have noticed in that brief clip of the side job that they went through a significant change up, now being 8-bit minigames with the exception of the scorpion collecting one for some reason. They lack that amusing mundanity that the first game's jobs had, but they are mostly good fun, and you can play with Travis's cat Jean if you're looking for that amusing mundanity, and they are amusing, a bit like Tomodachi Life minigames. The only thing with these jobs is that they're no longer mandatory. Unlike in the original where you had to make money to pay a fee to get into the ranking battle, you can get into them as soon as you've beaten the last one. Because of that, the side jobs come off as a bit redundant. I mean, yeah, you can buy some weapons, clothes, food for Jean, and exercise at the gym, but it's not essential. Like I said, they are enjoyable, you could easily find yourself addicted to a couple, but they no longer aid in breaking up the fighting. You'll be doing little else if you skip all the optional stuff. So upon saying that, you'd assume that this game suffers from repetition that the first game didn't have. And it does, but not in the way you're probably thinking. No, for the most part, the combat is as satisfying as before. It's largely unchanged though. The most notable difference is that you'll occasionally play as someone else. The character Shinobu is playable for a small chunk, and Henry for just one boss that feels like filler. They're okay. Also optional are a couple of different katanas for Travis to wield, including a dual version that became my weapon of choice in the late stages of the game. There are a couple of new enemy types, but they're not going to strain your skills any more than the regular goons. You may have to dodge occasionally, but mostly you'll just be giving the A button a serious workout. It's very simple and a lot easier than before. Getting Travis's special abilities almost loses its novelty, it happens so much, and yet there is an odd satisfaction to it. You kind of feel like a one-man army plowing your way through hordes of foes, and the satisfying sound effects and fast-paced nature kept me engaged. The encounters are usually pretty snappy, so after some button mashing and the flicking of the Wii Remote, you'll be done long before fatigue sets in. That is, for most of the game. There becomes a point in the latter half where the game decides to throw hundreds of enemies your way, whether spawned in or a seemingly endless path of them. The combat is fun in quick bursts, but there is not nearly enough to it to warrant the absurd amount of fighting you wind up having to do in one go. It was during the build-up to the penultimate boss where the sheer number of enemies actually started to make me angry, partly because there were so many, but also the lack of difficulty. There's no challenge to overcome, so I was just left walking a little bit and fighting another group of baddies for a good 20 minutes. It becomes so monotonous. When I got to a new part of the stage and the save spot icon appeared on the map, I thought, oh, thank God, because I just needed a break. But then there's still a lot more fighting to do before you get there. And then as real insult to injury, a couple of these dreadlocked douchebags greet you right by where you save. Maybe if a little more had been introduced to the combat, then this part wouldn't have been such a pain. But it's the exact same gameplay from the last few hours that was very fun then, but is stretched to absolute breaking point there. Okay, maybe not the exact same, as there is still the matter of the assassin encounters to talk about. Now, even though you start off at rank 51, you don't actually fight 50 assassins. A few corners get cut in the story, but the ones you do are pretty fun. Okay, some stretch the definition of fun, but we'll get to them in a minute. A couple of them are pretty forgettable, but much like the first game, it takes the basic gameplay and makes it more strategic. Dodging becomes a lot more important, there's some that require certain tactics that are quite fun to pull off, and they can get pretty intense. A little bit too intense at times, mind you. Games like this are always interesting to review because in the moment, some of the tougher bosses had me wanting to tear them a new one in this video. And admittedly, devs can feel cheap when they throw a brand new attack at you in the later stages of the fight. Certain nitpicks in earlier parts like falling down and not being able to cancel an attack to dodge also become a lot more exacerbated in some of these one-on-ones. The fact that they have pretty large health bars that can take a while to knock out also makes having to restart annoying. But looking back on some of the fights that I disliked in the moment, I can't deny that they gave me an adrenaline rush. Each time I died, I came back with a vengeance, having picked up on little strategies that made a huge difference and made every little bit of damage I inflicted add to the pulse-pounding nature of the battle. I don't think it helped the narrative when Travis felt guilt over killing enemies that I was more than happy to disperse of, but then again, the looming anxiety I felt after beating them for fear that there might be a power cut or something before I had a chance to save didn't make beating them overly satisfying anyway. So can some of the bosses be frustrating in the heat of battle? Absolutely, but there's more than a fair share of fights that I actually enjoyed playing in the moment, the majority actually. But now that those difficult encounters are far behind me, I can appreciate the challenge they offered a bit more than I did. Well, maybe not for the final boss. Oh boy. Look, I might have been willing to call some of these fights bad in the moment, but the second phase of the last battle is so goddamn cheap. from having about a millisecond to dodge certain attacks before he knocks out a big chunk of damage, and then not even having a second to breathe afterwards before he's knocked out even more of your health. Look, I gave it a good attempt, but after all of the repetitive normal battles that the last third of the game offered, that was the point where I finally had enough. So, yeah, I technically didn't finish the final boss. But hey, at least I'm being honest about it, unlike in my Sonic Unleashed review. I certainly enjoyed my last couple of hours with the game less than what came before, but that shouldn't undermine the fact that I really enjoyed a solid amount of the experience nevertheless. The first game handles the difficulty spikes in a more invigoratingly tense way, has less dull stretches, and I do think that maybe the sequel lacks some of that initial freshness of its predecessor. However, the 2-year gap in between me playing these two games benefited my enjoyment of the sequel to where that mostly wasn't an issue. Its personality remains incredibly individualistic and always engaging to me, making for what felt like a solid expansion of the first. I do hope that the third game does add a little more to the series than this entry did, but regardless of if it does or not, Travis's cocky charm will surely win me over anyway. But for now, I had my grievances with this game, but at the end of the day, I can't think of any other game franchise quite like this one, and whether you like these titles or not, that's always worth admiring.